All right, it's great to be with you today. We are starting back into our chapter 1. We just barely got started last time. So let's look at our advanced organizer so you know what's going on. For our materials today, you want to have your activities 1-1, which you already worked on, and 1-2, have that handy. We'll be using that during the lesson. And for our agenda today, we're going to talk about why we should study geography, what geography is, and we'll also spend a bit of time talking about some famous geographers. Our main idea today is that geography not only describes the Earth's surface, it also helps us to understand what takes place there. So it's more than just a description. Okay? And our goals today, you should be able to define geography and explain why the field of geography is constantly changing and improving. So that's what lies ahead for our lesson today. We're going to start out with our chapter verse. We'll be starting each lesson with this. For this chapter, Isaiah 45:18. Read this with me. For thus saith the Lord that created the heavens, God himself that formed the earth and made it. He hath established it. He created it not in vain. He formed it to be inhabited. I am the Lord, and there is none else. Okay, we want to start with why should I study geography? Why am I taking this class? Well, geography offers something for everyone. Something for everyone. If you're interested in math, we'll have lots of statistics throughout the year. If you like literature, you'll be interested in knowing about the different events and areas that are alluded to in stories. Maybe you like maybe you're a military buff. You can find out where certain battles took place and how the geography affected the battle. Maybe you're a business person. We'll be talking a lot about international industry and trade and things that go along with business. And those are just a few examples. Maybe you're thinking, well, I like sports. We'll be talking about that this year too. So it ties in, geography just ties in to just about anything that you could be interested in. But the second reason, I guess we could say this is the important reason, is to know God and better serve him. I want to take just a little bit of time to review our spiritual goals for studying geography in chart form. Why study geography? We're going to compare the Christian viewpoint to the secular viewpoint. And as Christians in America, we have duties as individuals, but also as voting citizens. Not every country, not all Christians have that privilege and that responsibility. Christians in other countries don't have that. But here in America, we do have duties in both areas. Our questions are, why study the physical geography, the surface and climate? Why study human geography, industry and society? And why study regions and nations? I want to look at the secular view first, okay? Why should an individual study physical geography? The secular view is that a person needs to realize they depend on the environment, so they need to learn about it for their own survival. But the Christian view is that God created the world. We want to praise him and depend on him. Now, as citizens, the secular view, they believe that the government should limit economic development because they think of the earth as fragile. Okay, we might destroy the ozone layer or the forests or a certain strain of animal species. However, the Christian view says we need to utilize the earth. It has resources. It's resilient. It'll bounce back. God created that the trees keep growing. The animals keep producing. We can't tear the earth up. Although we can, do some damage. We need to be responsible. But he created it for us to use, for man to live on the earth. Why study human geography? Why do we study the people, the industry, and the society? Well, the secular view says, man is innately good. He can become perfect. He can improve. We need to respect all of the different cultures, all of their philosophies and religions, okay, their values. But the Christian view says, no, we need to realize that all people reflect God's image, but all men have turned. All we like sheep have gone astray. We need to learn to refute false philosophies, doctrines, and religions. We need to have a basis from which to witness to all people. We need to know about their religion and about their culture. We don't want minor differences to hinder our testimony. Okay? As citizens, the secular view focuses on human rights. And they'll make sure that the government doesn't infringe upon people's human rights. Many believe that government should support family planning and limit population growth so we don't overwhelm the earth. They want to break down international barriers and, unite in peace and love. Some of those do sound like good goals, but as Christians, we need to realize that we need to evaluate the current systems in family and government based on biblical standards. We want to support policies that support families, support leaders in governments that punish evildoers. We want to uphold our nation and not break down our national barriers. And of course, we do want to make sure that humans are respected. They're God's highest creation, made a little lower than the angels, and yet we differ from the secular view in our emphasis here. Okay? Then why study regions and nations? The secular view says, well, man has conflicts and problems because he's ignorant. He needs better education. We need more money for education. Or he's poor. He's living in poverty, and that's why people revolt against the rich leaders and the rich owners. If you think of Marxism, that was his theory. But the Christian says no. The conflicts between regions and nations are due to man's fallen nature. As long as sinful men are living here on the earth, there will be conflicts. Of course, God is superintending everything. He is sovereign, but man is fallen, and he allows us a choice to how we're living our lives. The secular view promotes a one-world government, the interdependence of the global economy, that nations should rise above regional interests and support a one-world government. Whereas Christians realize that the nations and their leader are God's instruments for blessing and punishment. All right, so human wisdom, even if we have one world government, we all try to share and cooperate, is not going to create the peace and unity that people are looking for. All right, we know that because man does have a fallen nature and man is sinful. So that's just a recap of our spiritual goals and why we should study geography. We also want to touch on 5 themes of geography. One is location, or position on the Earth's surface. Place includes the physical and human characteristics. Relationships within places between humans and environments. You should know the term movement, humans interacting on the earth, and the term regions, how we're going to learn how they form and change. We also need to talk today about what geography is. Geography comes from 2 words, geo, meaning earth, and graphy, meaning description. So put those together and we have a detailed description of the earth, especially its surface. But of course we do know that it includes more than that. Another way to define geography, to put parameters around it, is to compare it to a subject that you're very familiar with. That would be history. So for history, we study time. What are we going to study for geography? Place. Our main tool in history is the timeline. Our main tool for geography? A map. In history, we're talking about what, when, and where. What questions do you think we'll be answering in geography? Where, how, and why. Okay, so you can see there a comparison that helps define geography a little further. Now, there is more to geography than just talking about the surface of the earth, and we learned about the different branches a little bit in our previous lesson. First of all, we have physical geography. That is the study of the earth and its resources. But we also have human geography, and that is the study of man as he lives on the earth and uses its resources. So it's not just memorizing where the places are and filling them in on the map, but we'll be studying the people as well. We also touched on the two methods earlier. Systematic geography, that examines one branch of geography at a time, using examples from all of the different regions. So if we're talking about canyons, we have the Grand Canyon, and we'll pull in canyons from other regions as well. Then we'll be doing, that's our first few chapters where we're laying our foundation. Then we'll be studying regions. We'll be doing a regional study, and that's where we examine one region of the world at a time and use examples from all of the different branches of geography. So we'll be pulling everything we learned from those first few chapters and learning about it as we study throughout the world. Now, so we know why we're studying geography, right? And we know what geography is now. Hopefully you weren't overwhelmed from our last lesson, all the goals we talked about. But today we're going to focus the rest of our time on the history of geography. And as we talk about the history, I'd like for you to have your activity 1-2 handy so that you can fill in this chart. You can get a little head start on your work. You can just do it during our lesson. And you'll notice that it says Chapter 1, Activity 2, and when I write that down for your assignment or for your materials, I'll be doing it like that, 1-2. 1 for the chapter, 2 for the activity. You can see that it says famous men in the history of geography. You'll be completing the chart. We have a row for people, the date, the accomplishments, and the significance of those accomplishments. And we're going to start off talking about ancient geography. And one important group of people were the Babylonians, and they created the oldest known surviving map, and it dates back to 2300 BC, and this map shows rivers and mountains, so it does have some topography, some detail on it. We'll move into the Greeks, and we'll spend some time talking about some specific Greek geographers. They were really the first to study the earth extensively, and then people built on their knowledge, including the Romans, who borrowed from the Greeks. I'm going to start by looking at Alexander the Great. I was thinking Greek, great. The Great Greek. He's your first person here, and his information's already filled in for you. He reigned from 336 BC to 323 BC. He conquered Persia and marched into India. This is important because he hired surveyors to go along with his armies and survey the land, make maps for him, and find out, what are we facing here? Do we have to cross a river? Are we going up a mountain? And this was very important because it really, he conquered so much area, it really expanded the Greek knowledge of world geography at the time. So that's the significance. It was very important. And then another Greek who was very important in the field of geography was Eratosthenes. And he has a tricky name, but we are going to talk about him a good deal. He lived around 276 BC to around 195 BC. I checked a couple sources. Nobody seemed to know any exact dates, and those are the ones there for your chart. But he was the first person to use the actual term geography. He put that together, geo, earth, graphy, description. And he also wrote a book entitled Geography that pretty much told everything the Greeks knew at that time about the earth, the surface of the earth. He also believed that the earth was a sphere, or spherical, so that's an important idea that he had. And he even calculated the earth's circumference, and this was an important accomplishment of his. And people have used, he was very, very close. We'll talk about that a little bit more. Here's a map of the world according to Eratosthenes this is around 200 BC. You can see that it's not accurate compared to what we know today, but they did know a great deal. I was amazed, Europe, they have Italy, they have the Siberian Peninsula, and they have the Arabian Peninsula. There are many details, and I was just amazed. How did they know it looked like that? They didn't have any pictures from space to draw their maps, so they were very accurate for the knowledge that they had. And in your textbook, on page 4, there is a little drawing that shows a little bit, tells a little bit of how Eratosthenes did his figuring. He was a mathematician, so if you wanted to learn more about it, you could maybe talk with your math teacher about it. But he knew the distance between Syene and Alexandria. This is now called Aswan in Egypt. He knew that that was 500 miles. Of course, they didn't use miles at that time, but he knew the distance. He measured at a time when there were no shadows at Syene. He measured the shadow at Alexandria. It was a 7-degree angle. He used that angle. He found that it was 7 degrees out of 360. Then he multiplied to find out the circumference of the Earth. He came up with 25,000 miles. It's only about 140 miles off of the figure that we now go by. So he came within 200 miles of being accurate on the measurement of the Earth's surface. So it's just amazing to me that he was able to do that. However, he did assume that Aswan, or Syene, and Alexandria were on the same meridian. Were they? Let's look in your textbook to check out his theory. On page 509, you have a map that shows Egypt, and it shows both cities. Let's see, here's Aswan, and here's Alexandria. Here's our meridian. So they're not on the same meridian. Would that affect his calculation at all? Well, if we look at our globe here, I have a little string. Let me see if I can find, it won't matter if you don't see exactly where I'm marking, but here's Egypt. Okay, here is Alexandria, and here is Aswan. All right, so if I stretch this between the two of them, I'm going at this angle. All right. Now, is that going to affect his measurement? Woo. Well, if our Earth, whoops, I'll pull it back down here. If our Earth was a perfect sphere, it would not affect his measurement. But you can see at the angle I'm going at here, it's going to affect his measurement some because the Earth bulges at the center. So it's going to affect his measurement a little bit. Maybe that's where his 140 miles off, 120 miles off. Maybe that's why he was off just a little bit. But he was still very accurate in his measurement. And this was a very important contribution that he made. He not only made great contributions to mathematics and geography, but also geodesy, which is the study of the size and shape of the Earth. So that might be something that you're interested to. So in addition to the measurement of the circumference, he also calculated how much the Earth tilts on its axis. Okay? He calculated that, and he used that figure to identify the tropics of Cancer and the tropics of Capricorn. We'll be learning about those in chapter 3. This was like, what did we say, 200 BC? So he made some very great contributions. Now, another Greek who made some important contributions to geography was Hipparchus. And he lived in 2nd century BC. And he developed a grid. A grid is just a regular pattern of intersecting vertical and horizontal lines. Think of graph paper, that's a grid. But the significance is, this is very important, the grid made locating places on maps very easy. Can you imagine trying to find a spot without having any latitude or longitude numbers to go by? Okay, so that's his important contribution. And we recall that the Romans borrowed some of their information from the Greeks, and Ptolemy was the most famous Roman geographer. And he lived during 2nd century AD, and he drew a famous world map. Now, Eratosthenes also had a version, but Ptolemy had a famous world map, and he also promoted the geocentric theory. This is the idea that the Earth is the center of the solar system, and this was actually accepted. It was unchallenged for about 1,400 years. 14 centuries, nobody challenged Ptolemy's ideas. And here is a version, Ptolemy's version, and you can also see the same version if you want a little closer look at the details in your textbook on page 4. But notice that Asia is kind of out of proportion. You can see here's Asia right here. Also, he used the grid. He borrowed Hipparchus's idea of the grid. And there's something missing. There's no Western Hemisphere at all, is there? We have Europe and Africa, and that's it. But that was, and still I was amazed at all of the things that he does have on his map of the world at this time in 2nd century A.D. Then we move into the Middle Ages, which isn't mentioned in your textbook, but Europeans continued to draw maps during this time. It was mainly the monks and the clergymen, and they made real fancy, elaborate maps, and they would show the whole cosmos. They'd have heaven, they'd have the outer spheres, they would have the earth, and hell would be really far below the earth. And they even included paradise. It was a little island in the east. I don't think anyone's found that island yet, but they would label that as paradise on their maps. Then we move into the Age of Exploration. In the late 13th century, so we're skipping a big gap here, Marco Polo wrote about his travels to the Far East, and his book, along with the early 15th century translations of Ptolemy's works, helped usher in the Age of Exploration. And you should have already read some excerpts from Marco Polo's books, right? And answered a few questions about them. So these were the type of things that people were reading during this time, and you'll need to be sure to have your answers checked by whoever is checking the answers for you, and see that you got everything correct. But you'll notice that he did exaggerate a little bit, but there were some facts that to the people who were reading it back then probably sounded just as exaggerated as what was exaggerated. So it would have been difficult, I think, for them to tell when he was exaggerating and when he wasn't. Some people just said, oh, he just made all of it up. But this helped spark the Age of Exploration. People heard about these areas and they said, boy, we'd like to go see them. Ptolemy's things were reprinted, translated, and people read them, and it really made them curious about what was out there. And there are 3 men who are really important during the Age of Exploration that you want to remember: Christopher Columbus, Nicholas Copernicus, and Gerhardus Mercator. Now, starting with Columbus, what famous idea is often associated with him? The round earth idea, isn't it? The spherical earth. The earth is round, not flat. Well, during this time period, many people still believed that the earth was flat. So think back, to where they were. What evidences could they cite for their idea that the earth was flat? Is the world flat? Think of the evidence the ancients could observe. What are some common sense proofs that the earth is flat? All right. It appears to be flat when you look out. It doesn't curve. And no one travels east and reappears in the west. If someone's traveling, they come back from the same direction. Okay? So those were some ideas that they had. But what about those who at that time and before believed that the earth was round? Is the world round? What are some common sense proofs based on the ancients that the earth is round? Well, this one's a little harder, but they could look out and see all the planets and other moon, other heavenly bodies are round. The earth cast a round shadow during a lunar eclipse. And what about this one? Ships disappear over the horizon slowly, not all at once. They don't fall off, and they also return. Okay, so that would have been difficult during that time period. But remember, Christopher Columbus wasn't the first person to believe that the earth was round. Do you recall? Who did we just talk about that believed the earth was spherical? Eratosthenes, right? And there were other Greeks that believed the earth was round. Plato lived around 427 to 347, around that time period, BC. He also argued that the earth was spherical, but not based on observation, but based on his philosophical proofs. He said, well, the world is just a shadow of the eternal forms, the perfect forms, so what form could be more perfect than a sphere? It obviously then is a sphere. On the other hand, Aristotle, who lived a little after that, 384 to 322 BC, was an inductive philosopher, and he gathered evidence on eclipses to support his conclusions. But about 50 years after Columbus set out, 1492, about 15 years after that, in the 1500s, Nicholas Copernicus published his revolutionary work in which he challenged the 1,400-year-old belief in the geocentric theory. And he lived in 1543. He promoted the heliocentric theory. This is the idea that the sun is the center of the solar system. And at this time, this was revolutionary. Just as Columbus, however, wasn't the first person to think the earth was a sphere, Copernicus wasn't the first to think that the sun was the center of the solar system. Aristarchus of Samos was a Greek philosopher from Eratosthenes' day, and he made the suggestion that the earth moved around the sun, but they said, nah. They just rejected his theory, so they didn't believe him. Mercator is our other important person that we need to learn about, and the date that goes with him is 1569. He drew what is thought of as a modern world map, and he actually raised the standards of cartography. And by cartography, we mean map making. And this cartography was flourishing during this time period. And we will be learning a little more about him and his grid in another section. But first, we want to talk about modern geography. Now, as imperialism began, the rulers that were conquering these lands wanted more details on their maps for their armies and just to see where they were colonizing. They also began to show topography on maps. That's a record of the Earth's physical features, including altitude. The meter in the 18th century was developed by the French, and also during that time England became the leading sea power and thus the leading map maker. As modern countries became more advanced and gained more technology, they put that into play in their maps. They had thematic maps showing climate and population, resources, and so on. They used technology to add details. They used airplanes and radar and infrared satellites. So the modern maps are much more detailed. What's the future of geography? Well, we can't be certain, but we know that exploration continues. There are jungles with unknown species. The ocean floor has many undiscovered animals. There are mountain peaks that have never been climbed, caves that have never been explored. Human geography has a big future as well. There are always wars and treaties going on, technology, economics is constantly changing, and missions face new challenges as well. So you can see that geography is a constantly changing field, and it is very current, and we'll be talking more about current events next time. Right now, let's go ahead and look at your assignment. You need to read pages 2 through 5. That will reinforce what we talked about today, and complete the section review on page 5. While you're reading, think about these questions. What does geography accomplish, and why is it always changing? The answer to your where in the world question, well over 90% of the world's fresh water is locked up in polar ice caps. Where can you find the coldest place on Earth? See if you can figure it out before I see you next time.